Now we're going to get into our top fives. This is my number 5 favorite movie of all time, Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood. Just watched this movie again a couple days ago, and this is one of my favorite filmmakers, making a movie that is, it was a departure from his previous films. They were all kind of like LA centric and, of our time. And then he goes into this period piece, and it's a central character. And we start off the film just with basically no dialogue and just watching this man. I'm going to bring it back again. It's obsession. I mean, he is absolutely obsessed with succeeding in his goal of, building an empire. And he starts by himself in a hole, and he will not give up from the very beginning. And it's also punctuated by the amazing cinematography and the was it Elswit? Did he win that? No, he didn't win that. He did win that year. Elswit did. Robert Elswit won that year because he beat out Roger Deakins, I believe, for No Country for Old Men. Unless I'm getting those mixed up, but I will check on that in a second. So we've got amazing cinematography at the beginning, and we've also got an absolutely amazing score by Johnny Greenwood, and I think this was his first score too, a feature-length score. So the guitarist for Radiohead, comes in with an amazing orchestral score, small orchestra score for this film from the very, very beginning. And one thing I noticed this time watching the film is we get the first scene is him with a pickaxe, banging away at the bottom of this hole looking for silver, and we get this piece, and it's actually this, it's just like a bunch, like a cacophony of strings, and they all kind of like coalesce together into a single note, and they kind of break away again and then come back together. And the name of that track is called Henry Plainview. And then I realized that later on in the film, we also see him. I mean, spoilers for There Will Be Blood, I guess, because can't really talk about this without spoiling things. He's killed his fake brother, the guy who thought it was his brother, wasn't his brother, and he's swinging a pickaxe to break the ground to make a grave for, the Henry Plainview guy who he's just killed. And at that moment, that's when that same piece of music comes back in, where it's that, like strings that are kind of bouncing all over the place and just kind of like, going around different notes, and then they kind of coalesce together into that single note, and they break apart again. So it's a symmetry from the beginning to that point. And these are critical moments in his life. The first critical moment in his life that we see on screen is him able to create his empire by starting with a hunk of silver and then reinvesting it and creating a business from that. So that is the beginning of his professional life. And then we also see this point in the movie where he's just killed his would-be brother. That's kind of like the end of his hope in humanity. And he even has that amazing speech where he says, I just can't handle it. He's like, I can't handle, he hates other people, but having a brother there, it gives him some sort of hope in people in general and humanity in general, but then also in the value of family. And once he loses that, he's already lost his would-be, his adopted son. He's lost, in his eyes, lost his son because his son can't hear, and his son is not normal in quotes, or whatever he feels like normal is. And so he's already felt betrayed a little bit by that, but he's always had, that to, he's had that that experience with his son, and then also the experience with his would be brother, and that's what gives us the end scene, that we get to see him interacting with with his son at the very end. I'll bring up one other symmetry that we see right after he brings in the piece of, well, after he breaks his leg and then hobbles in, crawls in with this silver, and they crush the silver, and he signs his name to take receipt of the money for the silver. We see this very determined and eloquent signature where a lot of care is taken. And at the very end of the film, right before he sees his son for the last time, he is being given this book of checks, and he has to go through and sign a bunch of checks, and his signature is just all over the place, and he uses a little kind of stamp type thing to dry the ink before he moves on to the next page. But when he does that, it ends up smudging the signature. So we go from this purposeful and carefully done signature at the beginning of the film, with all of his hope at the beginning of the film, to this just kind of like afterthought, like mishmash and wash of ink at the end of the film, when all of his hope is lost. I haven't even talked about Paul Dano and what I think about his performance. I've definitely come around on his performance. I initially thought it was over the top, but I think that is necessary for what Paul Thomas Anderson wants to do in this film, to represent the hypocrisy of religion in some ways, where we see someone using religion as a way to become famous, or a way to gain money, and about how there's an extreme parallel between someone who's using people, both of these characters using people for their own personal gain. One of them, he's using these people's land for his own personal gain, promising things, kind of like trying to take advantage of their what they hope he's going to do for them, making promises he's never going to keep, and then just moving on. And then the Paul Dano character, Eli Sunday, he's preying on people, on their emotions and on their vulnerabilities as far as their relationship with God is concerned, to get himself into a better position in life. And he does a lot better in the later portion of the movie, where he's able to, I guess, get on the radio and start to spread his, what his word is to more people. But then, kind of all comes crashing down for him too. At the very end of the film, we get, it's a sad film, and it's a bleak film, but it's amazingly shot, and it has great performances throughout, and it does something that is to me is one of those things where you see these horrible people, and you see what humans are capable of, I guess, and it kind of gives you a cautionary tale of what happens when obsession takes over, and when single-mindedness takes over, and when compassion isn't involved in your life, and how you can be absolutely and utterly just dejected and poor, even though you're in a mansion where you're shooting, plates from across the room. I mean, he has everything, and it's worth nothing. So that may come up later in this podcast. So that's There Will Be Blood for me. Let me see if I got anything else. We're getting in the top 5, and I'm just like, these are huge films, and I could probably talk about them forever. But yes, that's enough from me.
Well, don't you think that most of these films that we've talked about, especially yours, of course, have to do with obsession? And be careful of what you wish for. You might very well get it, regardless of what you're talking about. Eva Marie Saint's character on the waterfront wants to know what happened to her brother. Be careful, because what she finds out is not what she wants to hear, and she becomes obsessed about it to the point where she puts herself in a lot of dangerous situations that could get her killed. I mean, her life is at stake a couple of times in that film because she is obsessed with knowing what happened to her brother. So I guess obsession is a great start for a narrative for a film. And I think that strong characters where you learn, what's the old expression? What's a man's worth if he gains the world but loses his soul? That type of thing. That's what Daniel Plainfield does, right? Or is that his name?
Plainview.
Did I get it right? Plainview. What I say, Field? And by the way, best achievement in cinematography was Robert Elswit. Is that how you say his name? Elswit. From There Will Be Blood. He did win that year.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good deal. So.
All right. So moving along to my top 5. My number 5 is The Matrix. I love this movie. I have from day one. I had this experience when I watched it that I really believed we were in the Matrix when I was watching it. And my roommate came home. This was years ago. 1999 was a good year for film. 2 films make it to my list from that year. And I was watching The Matrix, and he was like, "Oh, I've seen this movie." And I stopped it and I said, "This can't happen, right?" And he was like, "What?" I was like, we're not in a computer program, right? We're not like being used as batteries, right? Or what? And he was like, "You might want to step away from this movie." So in concept alone, I love the movie. I thought it was a great way to start this new decade going into the 2000s in a new and interesting way in a sci-fi film, because it's definitely sci-fi. But at the same time, it's handled so realistically that you buy into it. Now, I know that you said that you've seen it recently and that you thought some of the CGI was not holding up and not aging well. That kind of stuff never bothers me, because on some kind of level, I saw it when it originally came out that it wasn't exactly what was realism, because it's not. It's CGI. So I accept that for what it is. I understand what you're saying. I did see it less than a year ago. I saw all 3 less than a year ago, and I see what you're saying, especially on DVD, especially on TV. Some of the stuff doesn't hold up as well. But that definitely does not outweigh what we have because of that film and the technology that was developed to shoot that film, and everything that was developed just to make that movie, and how it has influenced so many things, bullet time, all of the stuff. The idea of actually setting up a whole bunch of cameras to take one shot and put them all together, how that has never been thought of before or utilized like that before, it's like, oh yeah, that should have been happening a long time ago. It's not that unique of a technique. It's just the way that somebody put it all together. And I'm not sure who came up with that. There are different listings for best effects and sound effects and visual effects. So there's 4 different people listed for that. I'm not exactly whose idea that was. All of those people were nominated for Oscars. I guess maybe you can look up who started Bullet Time or who came up with the idea of Bullet Time.
Yeah, I think it was John Gaeta, because I remember in the special features, they talk about that, and he's the one, the Gaeta, John.
Yeah,
Gaeta.
I would say it was Gaeta. Yeah, well, he's listed as number 1 on the list of best effects that were nominated and won the Oscar for best effects, visual effects, and sound effect editing, best sound, best film editing. I think it won 4 Oscars, and it was nominated for 4 Oscars, if I'm not. Yes, I'm looking right at it. The point is this. Those effects are great. Some of them are aging better than others, but they serve the narrative. They serve the story. There is something about throwing a cool fight sequence into a movie because it's a cool fight sequence. I'm good with that. But the fight sequences mean something in this film. They come to a Western standoff, almost to the point where the newspaper and the subway rolling down the train track looks like tumbleweeds. And, you kind of hear that old Western music. And I'm not I don't think it's there, but in my mind's eye, it's there. And, you can hear like whips and guns and stuff like that in the back of your head. He sets it up. They set it up. The Wachowskis set it up to where you know what they're imitating, but they've found a new and interesting way to do that, because that gun battle at the end is like nothing I've ever seen before. You could say that about most of the special effects in this film, but at its core, it still has a human story. And it comes down to what Trinity says, that the Matrix cannot tell you who you are, that some other person, some other machine, some other computer program cannot tell you who you are. That has nothing to do with the Matrix and the storyline. That has to do with our human existence. That has to do with, you cannot be told who you are by anybody else. And in 1999, that was a very important message to me. I don't even think I thought of it that way back then, but it was a very important message to me. And I'm proud to say that I immediately saw this film and thought, wow, like this is epic on so many different levels. The characters are great. Switch, Apox, Mouse, all of them, they're great. Lawrence Fishburne, it's now been imitated so many times with the red and blue pill, and imitation is the highest form of flattery, and people continuously imitate this film, and they will continuously imitate the film in the future. And it's one of those movies that when I watch it, I want to watch it again immediately. I don't know why I have that reaction. I have some movies that are like that. But this one is just one of those ones. And here's the thing about this movie that I find interesting on top of everything. When I'm watching it on cable, if I don't watch it from the beginning, I don't watch it. If I come in on it, I don't watch it. I want to see it from the beginning because it's so great from the very beginning to the very end. Because especially if you don't know anything about what's going on. If you don't, APOC, okay, it was driving me crazy. Switch and APOC, I love them. And Dozer and Tank, they're great. Especially Switch, she's my favorite character in the film. But it is mind-blowing in its concepts. It's mind-blowing in its special effects. People give Keanu Reeves a hard time, but he is believable, and that's the only requirement that I have for somebody in this kind of position. The characters have their backstories, sort of, but it's more about what's at stake with the characters in the narrative as we're seeing it in real time. It's not necessarily about where they came from or what, because you don't really find a whole lot about Neo other than he's living a double life and so forth and so on. You don't really find out much about him. You don't really find out much about them in the Animatrix either, but that's not a bad thing, because what's important is what's happening to the characters. And you can see how they've been affected by it. You can see how each one of them is looking at Neo like, you're going to go see the Oracle? Buckle up, buddy, because, this, even one of them says everything changed after that. And then when they find out that Morpheus and Neo are fighting for the first time, that's obviously happened before. And then when Neo has to jump across the building for the first time, that's obviously happened to all of them before. And the consequences of what that is not necessarily what it should be in the film, but it is what it is to serve the narrative. And I could continuously talk about this movie. I could watch this movie. I could venture to say I could probably watch this movie at least once a week and not get bored with it. After you do something like that, though, you start to nitpick at things, and I don't want to do something like that with this movie. But it's not the same feeling on my list like On the Waterfront is an important film for people who love film and who are venturing into loving films. They should see On the Waterfront. They should see There Will Be Blood. I don't really concern myself with saying The Matrix because, one, most people have seen it, and two, that's not what it's about for me. What it's about is it's mind-bending in concept, and it's emotionally sound in its narrative. So that's every requirement I have. So there you go.
Awesome. All right. Okay, my number 4 is Terry Gilliam's Brazil. And I just rewatched this movie today. And I it's a movie. It is, in some ways, it's of its time. It came out in 1985, and it's, loosely based on Orwellian, like 1984, that his novel. But I think that, Terry Gilliam kind of brings it, much like what the Coen brothers do, where they're interested in a bunch of different things, and they're kind of like throwing them all in the pot. I think Terry Gilliam is interested in, government bureaucracy, and the lengths at which people will go to just, like, these people in this movie are living in a world where, I mean, they're putting up with so much bureaucracy and red tape and paperwork, and everything is harder than it needs to be. Like, when the main character Sam Lowry gets a phone call, he can't just like pick up the phone. He's got to like find the yellow cord, and then find the yellow plug, and then put the yellow cord in the yellow plug, and then he can pick up the phone. It's, all these things. You've got automation. When he wakes up, the automation is supposed to make his toast for him and make his coffee for him and do all these things, but inevitably it breaks down, and he has to deal with that, and he has soggy toast and no coffee. And the computer monitors, even, like, it's all these little touches that I just love. It's every single frame has a new and interesting twist on the current, what Terry Gilliam and Tom Stoppard were seeing at the current time, and how they could extrapolate that into a future that was kind of like an exacerbation of all the things that they thought were problematic, and how the world, what I think Terry Gilliam felt like the world uh, was trying to do to art. And because, I mean, Terry Gilliam at his core is an artist, and he sees things that are, he puts things in this movie that are the antithesis of art, as far as like food. Instead of making food that looks good and tastes good, they make food that is represented by a picture, and it has to be ordered as a number, and it comes as a glob of goo, and it's supposed to maybe taste like steak. Nobody really knows. And the way that they handle aesthetics, this world values efficiency over aesthetics in a lot of ways, where they've just got ducks running through their rooms because the government's involved in putting the ducks in, and that's just what they're going to do, because they don't care what it looks like. I mean, the way that they do their computer screens, where they have like a miniature television screen, an old like cathode ray tube television screen, and they use this big lenticular magnifier to make the screen bigger, even though it doesn't make the screen bigger, and it makes it look worse. And it's actually more work than it would be to create a bigger screen. That doesn't matter. That's just how they do it. This is all kind of like embodied by the character of Kurtzman, where he's so wrapped up. He's just like a ball of nerves, played by Ian Holm, and it's an amazing performance. And he is just so worried about getting in trouble. And I think that's the key. You've got the boss being worried about getting in trouble, and all of the people that are working underneath him, whenever he's not looking at them, they're watching Westerns, and they're watching Casablanca, and they're just trying not to work. And because there's no benefit to work, and there's no reward to doing anything more than just the bare minimum. And so I think that's a political statement on Terry Gilliam's part, and on Tom Stoppard's part. And there's some great performances. You see Katherine Helmond in there. And I think that Jonathan Pryce does a great job as this main character. He has to do so much. He has these dream sequences which seem in some ways out of place, but they give you they give you the feeling that that those dream sequences differentiate him from everyone else around him. And we get Robert De Niro in there a few times. He also seemed a little bit out of place in the film, but when he comes in, it's refreshing, and we get to see a couple of times you get to see the scene where Robert De Niro is fixing Sam Lowry's Harry Tuttle is his name, fixing Sam Lowry's ducts and air conditioning, and then Bob Hoskins, and I don't know the other guy's name, but just that the banter between those two guys and how they interact with Sam Lowry is amazing, and I just love a lot of these like miniature scenes that kind of give you an idea and a view into this world of absurdities, and throughout all of it, you get this kind of like just simple love story. Guy seeking after a woman, just trying to find this kind of like idealized version of this woman, and the movie, depending on what version of the movie you watch, I guess, ends differently. And once again, this may be one of those movies where it's like it's a downer movie. It kind of ends on a down note when you kind of look at it from a whole. But we get to see this I haven't said it yet in this podcast, but world building. To me, it's a great masterful example of world building and creating something that I know that these characters are living in. Even though it's an extreme version of a world, it still seems lived in, and the stylistic choices that he makes, whether it's the huge Ministry of Information with the big monoliths and huge marble pillars and all that stuff, and just the imposing portions of that, kind of looks like I don't know, like expressionism type things. The costumes are noirish, but it's in the future, so I don't know why people are dressing like that. I'm not really sure, even though it's in the future, but they're wearing clothes from the past. It's kind of like an out of time type thing to me, which I think is really, really cool. And a couple other movies that make me when I was watching it today, that just popped into my head were Delicatessen and Sorry to Bother You. And I think that, Sorry to Bother You is the most recent example of this, where, this world that they're displaying in that film is something that's like believable. Obviously it's believable, but there are extreme things happening, whether it's the company that tells that you can go to and live there, and they feed you and you just like work like a slave for them. That doesn't seem like something that would be possible. And then similarly in Brazil, it doesn't seem like having ducks just in the middle of your apartment would be possible, or that everybody's just going to be going out to dinner and eating just like chunks of goo, and that's going to be fancy. That just doesn't seem possible. But in this world, it does seem possible. Same thing with Delicatessen. It's such a kind of an out there concept that we can that we think of this French apartment complex that just kind of turns their head when they realize there's no meat anywhere, and they all of a sudden get meat from the Delicatessen in the bottom floor, and we get to meet all these different people. So like those movies, like I love those types of kind of like world building movies, and this is one of the ultimate examples of that too. I will bring up Michael Palin's performance as Jack Lint. He's kind of like the ultimate black hat, and he actually does wear a black hat in the movie, and a black trench coat and all that stuff, but the way that that he plays him is just, he's jovial, he's just happy, and he's and things couldn't be better, and his family's great, and he's just being a horrible person, but because the government, because the bureaucracy assigned him that task, he is absolved from any kind of guilt that he might have for what he does all day, every day, and who he affects all day, every day. And it's that separation that that bureaucracy allows people to separate themselves from their actual actions, from their actions and their responsibilities as humans, that I think they're trying to get at in Brazil. And it's just, it's awesome. I love it. And I love watching it. Once again, there are certain scenes that maybe you might consider to be dated. I do love the practical effects in there. I think that's one thing where, I'm not going to look at this movie and say that, like, the CGI is bad in it, because there is no CGI in this thing. It is all practical effects, for better or worse. But I do mentally give it a pass on some things because of the practical effects in there, as opposed to something like The Matrix, where it's like, no, I'm holding it to 2018 standards when I watch it in 2018, and it does not meet those standards. And it's like, yeah, that's tough for that movie. But okay, so that's my spiel on Brazil.
Well, first of all, there is a corporation that hires people and makes them live in apartments in order to have jobs in the corporation, and you have to, your rent is automatically taken out of paychecks. And if you lose your job, you lose your apartment. But if you lose your job and want to stay in the apartment, you still have to pay. I mean, there are places out there that exist like that. So the likelihood of a slave camp for work horses, based on something like Sorry to Bother You, does exist on some kind of level. The scene in The Beach when Leonardo DiCaprio is walking out of the hotel or cottage, whatever you want to call that, hotel-like area, and the lady's mopping the electrical sockets that are sticking outside of the walls, and he keeps going, electricity, electricity, like you're got a mop with a wooden handle in water and you're mopping electricity, dude, like you can't, and it's going zzz. So for the air ducts to be all seen in apartments is not that far of a logical jump to how some people in some cultures design certain things. That's just the way that it is. So I don't think Brazil is that far off from those kinds of predictions, and we're always looking for some kind of way to minimize but maximize our food intake by making it into some kind of protein bar, by making it into some kind of protein shake, by making it into some kind of pill with cranberry extracts and all this other stuff. Now, is it the exaggerated truth of the plop of food that happens in Brazil? No. But we are in a society where we do look at a menu and go, number one, please. So it's not that far off. You were saying that it doesn't seem logical in this world, but I think it's a lot closer now than probably what it was when that movie first came out. So it's interesting how art imitates life, but it also is a predictor of things to come in life too, and that might be a logical conclusion. You see the way a pair of scissors work, and then you think, okay, well, we can put a blade to that can cut that faster. Then we can put a blade to it that can do it automatically, and then we can do it underneath a machine. I mean, there are logical steps to how people's brains work and how things become functional. So those kind of things don't strike me as that far off from where we're at in the world now. It's just done in this dystopia futuristic world in Brazil that is fascinating and beautiful to look at. And that film does not end on the highest of notes, but for me personally, I don't feel bad after seeing that movie because I feel like he accomplished what he needed to accomplish. He wanted to be in a certain place by the end of the film, and he is in that certain place, albeit not what the reality would dictate, but it's still, to me, doesn't leave me, with a Debbie Downer feeling. It just doesn't. All right, so my number 4 is Jaws.
Nice.
I talked earlier about how, Cool Hand Luke came from another buddy of mine list, and so did Jaws. And I thought, oh my God, Jaws is just great. First of all, I grew up in Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and I was a beach baby. I spent most of my existence at the beach all the way until I went to college and have come back to the beach many times since. But the beach has never been the same ever since Jaws. It just hasn't. I hear the music when I'm in the water. I look for shadows, and I'm scared to death that that shark is going to come up from underneath me to this day. I was just at the beach on the 4th of July, and I got in the water, and I'm swimming around, and something touched my leg, and I thought, oh, it's Jaws, it's Jaws. I'm convinced it's Jaws. That movie had a psychological effect on me. I would wake up in my dreams in the middle of the ocean, just on my mattress, floating around. And I thought, as long as I didn't touch the water, the shark couldn't get to me. I was 10 years old when the movie came out. Can you imagine seeing that movie when you're 10 years old? It's devastating to this day to see it. People even jump to this day in the right places. And, everybody knows that's animatronic shark, but they do a really good job at making that shark look real. That on top of that, the first half an hour of the film, you don't even see the shark because, one, they couldn't get it to work right, and it actually built this tension that allowed to, when you finally do see the shark jump out of the water, when it does in that very famous scene. And my understanding is we're going to need a bigger boat is an improv line. That's what I've heard. If it is, that's amazing. The screenplay is impeccable. The character study is impeccable. There is development and backstory and the way that all three of the characters that come together to try to kill the shark interact. They're all three different people from different worlds, and yet they have one common cause, and they need to learn to work together to get this done. I like stories like that. John Williams won his Oscar for this, well, one of his Oscars for this. It put Spielberg on the map, although he was not nominated for the Oscar. It was nominated for Best Picture. There's a pacing to the film that it's almost like a horror thrill film, but it's more of a drama somewhere in between. It's genre breaking. There's nothing I don't like about this movie. Every single time I see it, I jump. Every single time I see the one scene when they're in the side bay, and because the sheriff makes his son puts the small boat into the small pond, and the little boy's like, "That's for babies." And there's a guy fishing out in the pond, and the shark knocks that guy's boat over, and that guy goes to get up on the boat, and that shark comes from underneath him, and then you see what happens. And every single time I see it, it scars me and it just troubles me that I cannot not watch it. But at the same time, it scarred me. That said, it's just one of those movies that once it's done, the conclusion is over and done with. You are relieved that the mission is complete the way that it's complete. There's a little bit of a bonus thing that happens kind of close to the end that you're not expecting to happen. And every time it happens, I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. For anybody who hasn't seen Jaws, you should see this movie. And you should definitely try to see it when they're showing it on the big screen during a festival or during a holiday or that kind of stuff. This is the first Memorial Day I did not see it because I try to watch it every Memorial Day. I don't know if it has something to do with being in the play or my timing or moving or whatever. I make no excuses. I did not watch it this year.
Memorial Day or July the 4th?
Oh, July the 4th, right. What'd I say? Memorial Day? I get all those holidays. Like this holiday, was it Labor Day that we just went through?
Yeah.
I can never remember. Is it Labor Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July? Whatever. Yeah, 4th of July. You're right. I get all these summer holidays mixed up. But anyway, the point is that I try to see it once a year. And now that we've made these lists and it's on my list, and it has been on my list for as long as I've ever made this kind of list, I need to see it again. And do you know they even made models of the shark jumping on the boat? There's a model where you can put it together with the boat sinking into the water and the shark jumping on the boat. And what happens when that happens is in the model. And I walked into a friend of mine's bathroom, and he had that. And I was like, that is simultaneously cool as hell and sick, dude, because that is not a great part of that movie. Like, why would anybody want to memorialize that scene? I understand why, because it is a impactful scene. But just everything about this, it's a chase movie is what it comes down to. It's, antagonist, protagonist, but the antagonist is a shark. And he does such a great job at filming all of the water sequences, meaning Steven Spielberg, that when those three barrels come up and start moving again, it's as scary as if that shark is coming up from underneath you, and it's three yellow barrels. It's just one of those films. It has this quick pace, but it takes its time when it needs to slow down. You need to learn things about the characters. It's got this really great relationship between a man and a woman who just want to do right by their kids, and they're stuck in this situation, and she's great. Lori Gray, I believe her name is. I can't remember her name right off the bat. I think it's Lori Gray, I think. Don't quote me on that. Josh is looking it up. Yes. Or Lorraine Gray. Anyway.
Lorraine Gary.
Oh, okay. I got it totally wrong. Okay, sorry. No disrespect. I should know that if I'm talking about it, right? Anyway, the point is that it's one of those movies where if you have not seen it, you should see it, which I've repeated 1,000 times about these movies that we're talking about. But it's just well done. It just is. So there you go.
Speaking of well done films, my number 3 film is Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. So that's probably the most underrated thing that anybody's ever said about Citizen Kane. Well done. It's
well done.
Well done. It's masterful from a technical level. It's an amazing character study. Once again, we're back to the obsession. There's a lot of parallels between Citizen Kane and There Will Be Blood. We do get to see the origin of Citizen Kane, the origin of Charles Foster Kane, whereas we don't get to see the origin of, we don't get to see what gave Daniel Plainview this drive that got him to the bottom of that silver mine, or of that hole that could have had silver in it and ended up did have silver in it. But we do get to see kind of the beginnings of Charles Foster Kane and how he was able, how he developed into what he ultimately was. And it's in it's I don't know what the audiences of 1941 were like, or what they kind of expected, if they expected more linear storytelling, but they did not get that with this film. But it's still very easy to track with. I think the fact that they started off the movie with a newsreel and kind of like lay out the plot before you really get to see the different versions of what people say about his life from that happened after that newsreel. It gives you kind of like a setting, and at least the characters before they get introduced to you in these kind of like interviews with the observer, the person who's trying to figure out what Charles Foster Kane's dying word Rosebud means. So I mean, once again, you kind of have like it's somewhat of a MacGuffin, Rosebud, but I mean, I think it does, obviously mean something, but it's the impetus for the story, and we get the story because of that. That's the device that they use, and the science that went into this movie is amazing to me. The things that they had to create to do what Orson Welles wanted to do. It's an interesting situation where you get someone who's a child prodigy, radio star, and he, says he wants to make movies, and RKO Pictures just like rolls out the red carpet for him and says like, you can have whatever you want, you can do whatever you want. And how many times has something like that happened, and either the person not been confident in their vision, number one, or the person not understood all the capabilities and possibilities, to where like your first movie may not be as good as I mean, I've just seen that in my list here. Some of my favorite filmmakers, a lot of these movies are there, kind of in the middle of the pack. Quentin Tarantino, Spike Jonze, even Terry Gilliam, Paul Thomas Anderson. They're all kind of like middle of their career, or multiple movies into their career. They're kind of like hitting their stride and being confident. Whereas Citizen Kane is just like it's an anomaly because you have a first time director who is not told no and who wants specific things, and he's surrounded himself by people who are willing to do that for him and willing to get that for him, whether it's the special effects that were created by Vernon Walker and his group of people, or the amazing lenses that Greg Toland developed and used to allow that deep focus from, foreground characters to things in the very, very background, whether we're looking at, Charles Foster Kane's mom at a table in the foreground and then looking through the window and seeing Charles, playing in the background with his rosebud sled and all that stuff, and everything's in focus from foreground to background, whether it's that or whether it's things like the ability to have his character walk from the foreground all the way to the background to like what looks like a normal room, but it ends up being this huge enormous room, and having huge windows above him, and you get to see how a film and how staging and how motion of the actor will inform that character, move him from being an imposing figure to a diminutive figure, and how what's going on in that scene is he's pretty much like signing away his newspapers at the time, and he's kind of like admitting failure in a lot of ways in that particular scene. So everything's done for a reason, and whether it's the angle of the shot, who's in the frame, how they're arranged in the frame, whether it's people looking down or people looking up at a character, or focusing on all the characters focusing on a piece of paper on the table in front of them, or you could just go on and on and on and on. Every shot is purposeful. There's no wasted film or no wasted opportunities in this film to have the technology that they were using in 1941 to give the audience a better idea of Kane, or his mistress, Susan Alexander, or his wife, or any of these things. Even that scene where they you get to see the whole evolution and devolution of a marriage in one scene, where you have the husband and wife eating breakfast together, and it just kind of does passage of time, and you get to see what they're fighting about and how their relationship changes, and even the angles that they use from the beginning to end of that scene. You get to see that all kind of happen right in front of you, and it's efficient storytelling, but it moves the story forward and you understand it completely. So there's some really, really cool effects, like back then. We're assuming nowadays, like, we've got cameras that can GoPro cameras, you can put that on a helmet, or you can stick it on your chest, or you can just carry it around and stick it on the side of a car, and it's not a big deal. But back then they had these huge cameras, and they needed all kinds of light, and just to move a camera took a huge amount of work. And to get the shots that he wanted, they weren't able to do what he wanted to do without having to modify certain things. Like, there's one shot that goes through the sign of Susan Alexander's nightclub, and the only way for them to do that is to break the sign in half and then like pull it apart as the camera goes through it. And it's just things like that where you're just like, there's no way to. I'm sure that they got to the point where Orson Welles said, like, no, I want the lens to go through. I want this shot to go through the sign. And somebody was probably like, yeah, but you can't do that because the sign's one piece. And he's like, probably saying, like, well, why can't we, figure it out, whatever you need to do. This is what's happening. We need to make this happen, and we need to do it my way. And once again, that's the obsession of a filmmaker, of a first-time filmmaker, and it mirrors the obsession of the Kane character. So, possibly to his detriment. I don't know. Orson Welles obviously was a successful filmmaker after this, but as far as like putting a flag in the ground, I mean, I don't know if there's any other filmmaker that's done it in the way that Orson Welles did with this film. Oh, and the music's awesome, by the way. Bernard Herrmann did the music for this. He's the guy who scored Psycho and Vertigo and Taxi Driver. I mean, but this was his first film score, and he did it up, man. Like, he wrote show tune, he wrote like an opera aria for the Susan Alexander character to sing poorly, so yeah, I mean, once again, this is another example of the music playing a big part in my love of film and of this film specifically.
Yes. That's what I have to say. Yes. Citizen Kane is not on my list, and I believe it's because all these touchy-feely films that I like made it on, but that's just who I am. But there is a resistance to putting it on because it is such a popular film when it comes to top 100 list, 10 list, number ones. It's on a lot of people's lists, and that's a really silly reason to not have it on a top 10 list. But when I see Citizen Kane, I don't have the same reaction to it that I do for the films that are on my list. I don't have that immediate, yes, I've got to watch it. I have this, oh man, am I in the right frame of mind to watch this? And that's a compliment. That's not a slight on the film at all, because everything that you say is true. What I did want to mention was, strangely enough, when I was thinking about our top 10 list, I knew Citizen Kane would probably be on one of ours. I vaguely remember it being on the one you originally made. I can't remember if it was or not. I'm pretty sure it was. But I wanted to mention I wanted to mention Joseph Cotten. He is the actor who plays Jedediah in the film, and I was thinking about him the other day when we were making the top 10 list, and I was thinking, he has such a difficult role in that movie, because he has to play the best friend, and he has to play the guy who supports him no matter what, and there's not a lot of conflict that he's involved in per se directly, as in like between two characters. He has some issues with Kane at one point, but that's over the newspaper. There's not like this screaming match that he has. He doesn't go toe-to-toe with another actor or actress. And then he has to convincingly play an older guy later on. And that to me is always difficult, because first of all, the makeup is brilliant. And I would say the makeup was brilliant for its time, but the makeup's brilliant, period. He looks old. As a matter of fact, I don't think they've gotten it that right, even in modern day films. Maybe Benjamin Buttons. But a lot of times when they make people look really old, it just looks like makeup. It looks like a mask. They got that right back then. And his performance in that scene is amazing. The way he's kind of that, I wouldn't say dirty old guy, but he kind of is a little, flirty with the not the interviewer, but there's this quality about him that is because of his age. And I can't remember if it's when he's talking about a woman or something. He's talking about somebody. He gets this kind of like cheeky smile look on his face. And I've seen older people with that remember when look. But at the time, the guy was in his early 20s. The actor was in his early 20s. So to actually play that age and to have that nuance at the same time is amazing to me. So I was happy that it was on your list so I could point him out, because I think he's got the hardest role in that movie. He's the everyday guy. It's hard to like maintain the everyday guy in amongst all these over-the-top performances. So I just wanted to mention that to piggyback on your top 10 list.
To piggyback on my.
What did I say, bank? I sure did, didn't I? As soon as you said that, I was like, what?
Yeah. Okay. I will say that, yeah, Joseph Cotton, if we're going to talk about his character Jedediah, his character is the one who's kind of like it's not the audience surrogate necessarily, because that's the interviewer, but he's the one who kind of shows the cracks in the veneer of Charles Foster Kane. He's kind of indicating to the audience that, the way that they do close-ups of his, whether it's, Kane after he's stolen all of the writers of the rival newspaper, and he's got a big party for himself, and he commissioned a song to be written about him, and is dancing around with these dancers. We see the juxtaposition between his character and then the other character, oh my gosh, Mr. Bernstein. And we get to see how Bernstein is like always the happy, always, it doesn't matter what Kane does, it's right and it's good. But with Cotton's character, he's kind of he knows where Charles Foster Kane started. He knows, they grew up and went to college together, so he knows where he started, and he's seeing this corruption happen little by little, and we see that indicated through the close-ups of him. So yeah, that's all. Sorry. Okay, next.
No problem. You could talk about that movie. You could have a whole years worth of podcast about Citizen Kane. It's just that good. And once again, everybody who asks me about movies, like I know anything more than anybody else, they ask me and I say, have you seen Citizen Kane? And they go, really? It's such a cliche. Have you seen it? No, not yet. Well, you can't say it's a cliche if you haven't seen it, first of all. Second of all, it's a cliche because of a reason. So see this movie and then let's talk, because it is one of those films that if you're looking for more than just storytelling and popcorn films, and that's fine if that's what you're looking for, I get that on so many different levels. But if you're looking for something with something more to add to filmmaking, Citizen Kane is the top of the heap. All right, so number 3, always will be, always has been on my list, Field of Dreams. I love this movie. It's the movie that made me realize that the theory about 90% of all films are about father-son relationships, which is ever-changing in a good way nowadays. Usually, even if when you have a female protagonist, there's some father-son situation happening in the movie that makes it important to the narrative that you go, okay, well, it's still there. But this is that film that the college teacher actually wasn't professor, said, that proves the 90% that most films are about father-son relationships. And this, of course, is, the quintessential father-son relationship. It's one of the movies that started me reading books after watching movies, because I was so intrigued by this film. And it was interesting to read the differences between a book and a film. I can't remember if I ever had that kind of lineup before. There are major differences, nothing that's worth talking about, but there's just a feel to this movie. And everybody says, oh, it's Frank Capra at its best, but just done by a 1989 director. And Phil Alden Robinson is the director's name. And they, of course, Capra-esque, they keep bringing that up. And I think that's a good way to look at this film. It has this mystique to it that you go from one time frame to the next, and it's a matter of walking across a street, and I don't have a problem buying into it. There's not an explanation for it. It is just what it is. There are these things that happen in the film that could only happen in a fantasy film, but it's grounded in such reality that it makes it real. And I'm a sucker for a good cry in a movie, and this ending to this film gets me every single time I watch it. And it's an interesting last shot. And I don't know if you remember or have seen this movie.
I do remember.
But, hey, Dad, yeah, you want to play some...
you want to have a catch.
Yeah, and the camera starts to swing around and around the field and then up, and then it kind of flies so far up that you see because the daughter talks about people coming and seeing this baseball field because they're talking about it's not making any money. It's a cornfield. Why would you plow down your corn to make a mysterious baseball field, but nobody can really see what's happening except for people who believe. And the little girl says, who is actually
Gabby Hoffman.
That's right, Gabby
Yeah.
Hoffman. Right, exactly. Which she's grown up to be great, and I'm glad she's still working.
Girls, Transparent. She's been in a lot of
Transparent. Yeah. She's been in a ton of things. She's done a couple or one Woody Allen film. She's done quite a bit. Anyway, she says, they'll come. Don't worry about it. And when that shot goes up and over top of the field, you see all of the lines of cars coming down the street. Well, actually all the way through the city and then down the street. And the way that they got that shot was by asking everybody in the two towns on both sides of the cornfields to turn their lights off. So everybody in those two towns turned their lights off so they could get that shot of just the car lights coming down the street. And there's hundreds of cars. That's amazing to me. That's because I think the spirit of this film spoke even before it came out. It's got fantastic performances. Gabby Hoffman's great. She's like 6-7 years old in it, James Earl Jones is great in it. Ray Liotta is great in it. Kevin Costner's great in it. I just lost the list again. Amy Madigan is great in it. It's just one of those movies that I can't speak about camera angles. I can't speak about lighting. I can't speak about technique. I can't speak about, why he chose to do what he chose to do. I can't say, oh, that sign looks this way because of this, or, it has this in this window because this represents this. None of that is in this movie for me. It's all there, but that's not what this movie's about for me. It's about every single time I see this film, I connect with it on the same level that I connected with it when I first saw it. And it's just really beautiful storytelling at its best. And I know some people are cynical and, have a much more jaded look at life. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that that's the way people are. And they think it's kind of schmaltzy and kind of cheesy and kind of heartstring pulling. And I get all that. But that scene when the doc walks across the field and walks across the rocks and the mystical thing that happens is just beautiful to me, because it's one of those things where no matter what your dreams are, the reality of them and the reality that you're facing are much more important than your actual dreams. And to not do what the doc did at that moment would have been devastating to the life of that family. And yes, it's not logical that it would happen. And yes, it doesn't make any sense except for in a movie. But that guy gave up his little dream to make sure that somebody else was secure. And I love that kind of stuff. So I don't have much more to say other than it's one of those movies that every time it's on, I watch it. I don't care what part of the film I'm in, I watch it. And then when it happens at the end, when you find out what is actually happening, it's just well done. There are some really great shots of when Kevin Costner's in the corn and he hears the voices and the camera's coming in and swooping in and going over top of him. I don't know how they did those, probably crane shots back then. But it's really well done. It just has this feel about it. So, Field of Dreams, number 3.
All right. My number 2 is Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Probably one of the longest titles ever made. But it deserves it because this is an amazing film. I did get a Kubrick movie on my list, and this is one of those movies where I can, like you said with Field of Dreams, I mean, you can jump in any time, but watching this movie kind of from front to back, and it's it's interesting because it has, limited music in it, and music's a big deal, whether it's score or music that's being chosen for this. Limited music, but the music that they choose, it's the Johnny Comes Marching Home march when they get the bombing run orders on the bomber, and that helps to bolster those scenes. And we know when we're going back to that, it helps to kind of like build tension and drive that. But ultimately for me, this movie is all about performances, and it's all about, once again, we go back to absurdity, and we go back to the fact that Stanley Kubrick wanted to write a film about war, and he wanted to write a film about the Cold War specifically, and about the possibilities of, he wanted to, adapt this book, Red Alert, and he wasn't able to do it in a serious manner. But the more that he got into the research for the film, he realized that just the absurdity of the situation that we found ourselves in the Cold War begged for a satire, and for something that was going to, how else can you talk about these things that one day you're totally fine, and the next day it's nuclear winter. So they went at it. Him and his co-writer Terry Southern went at it in the only way they felt that they could, is making things, taking things to an absurdity, taking the characters and ratcheting them up. There's famous stories of George C. Scott, doing his lines, and then Kubrick telling him, just go crazy with them. George C. Scott plays Buck Turgidson, and just saying just go all out, and just overact, and then we'll pick the ones where where you're just acting normal. Well, it turns out they picked all the ones where he was overacting, and it's an amazing performance, and he should thank Kubrick for making him do that, and for putting him in that position. So because it's a great character, it's an amazing performance. This all the way down the line, there are just, it's performance after performance, and Peter Sellers has 3 of them in this movie. We get to see him as Group Captain Lionel Mandrake, as President Muffley, Merkin Muffley. All these names are just, begging for, they're telling you immediately that this is a comedy, and that it's, I guess you could possibly sometimes call it a dry comedy. There are, punchline type lines, the famous, gentlemen, you can't fight in here, it's the war room. Yes, that's a funny line, but then just the whole, his whole, the president's conversation with the premier kiss off, of course. So, that whole conversation back and forth, where we only hear one half of the conversation, and the lines where he's saying well, I'm sorry and you're sorry, and that whole kind of push and pull of there's still this this assumption of niceties, even though they're talking about minutes towards nuclear destruction. They're still just trying to feel each other out, and be nice to each other, or at least he's trying to be nice to the premier, I guess, while the premier's drunk somewhere over in Russia. So and then Peter Sellers as Group Captain Mandrake. He's so kind of diminutive, and the way that that he phrases a lot of his lines. I think this movie, in a lot of ways, this movie is infinitely quotable, but you kind of have to be in the right company. It's lines where he's talking about, whether it's Peter Sellers as Mandrake, or Sterling Hayden as General Jack D. Ripper. You know, the inevitable, you know, the guy who started the ball rolling with this whole situation, you know, sending all of his planes out, and then putting them in a situation where it's difficult to get a recall code and all of that. So, you know, Sterling Hayden talking about precious bodily fluids and rainwater and grain alcohol and fluoridation of water and all those things. I mean, it's just it's for me. I love seeing those types of, you know, turning up to 11 absurdities and bringing those all together in seemingly basic dialogue scenes, but the whole time you're just you're just it's one of these movies where I don't know if you listen to a lot of comedians or watch a lot of stand-up comedy, but there are stand-up comedians where you are laugh out loud funny, like laughing out loud actively at them, and there are other stand-up comedians where you're just kind of like, you know, internally, you know, processing their comedy, and you're just like, that's funny, you know. And to me, this movie is, in a lot of ways, it's a that's funny type of a movie, and it's based on, you know, human actions, human interactions, and you know, we get characters that are, you know, multiple extremes. They famously were going to have Peter Sellers play the Major Kong, you know, bomb pilot, but he hurt his leg and he couldn't get the right accent. He couldn't figure out the right accent, so they brought in Slim Pickens, who is the most, you know, cowboyish, you know, human being ever, probably. And so he just kind of played himself, and it was great. It was perfect as this role. So we get to see James Earl Jones in an early role. He kind of pops his head out every once in a while, and you know, there's some great performances. So well written, very tightly written. There's amazing set design. You know, Kubrick, I think, saw what Ken Adam did for the set designs on some of the Bond movies, and then he wanted that same set designer for Doctor Strangelove, and he was able to get him, and that's how that war room looks. I mean, you know, a lot of that is practical set design, and there's little things that I don't know if people even really notice, like when Major Kong's looking at the Playboy magazine close to the beginning, the centerfold in the Playboy magazine is actually the assistant to Buck Turgidson. And when we see her for the first time, she's laying much in the same. She's like on her bed with a tanning light on her, but she's laying much in the same layout as she is on the fold out of the centerfold of the Playboy magazine. So it's little things like that that I just love, that you pick up on through the, you know, probably, I mean, I don't know, 50 times I've seen this movie. It's infinitely watchable for me. I have nothing bad to say. I have literally nothing bad to say about this movie, and that's, I don't think I've even said that about any of the other movies that we've talked about. I can't. You cannot assail this movie. It is. I will defend it to my dying day. So, Doctor Strangelove.
It is James Earl Jones' first movie, by the way.
Nice, man.
He did some TV. He did some TV before that, but that's his first movie. Can you imagine?
That's the way to start your career, right there. You know, go from that,
yes, sir,
to, you know, I'm sure he did other things, but then Darth Vader, and then you're in, you know, Field of Dreams, and then you're in a bunch of other awesome movies. So yeah, it's great.
Couple Oscar nominations in between, couple Emmys, couple Tonys, give me two. Yeah, he's talented as hell. Yeah, that's it's always interesting to me when directors find people for the first time. And you have to say Kubrick gets it right. He got it right. He just got it right. There's not much more you can say about that film other than, once again, it is without a shadow of a doubt a quintessential must watch if you're interested in movies above and beyond just entertainment value, because that movie is dense, filled with, it's just crazy and mayhem and just absurdity in its best possible way, and he gets away with it. And George C. Scott kills me every time.
I want to bring up one scene of George C. Scott where the president asks him, he's like, do they have a chance? And he's like, man, when those babies come barreling down, you ought to see them. It's gonna be amazing. And he's like, and then President Muffley says like, yeah, but do they have a chance? He's like, do they have a chance? He's like, hell yeah, they got a chance. And he realizes that he's caught up in his pride for his job and for the branch of the military he's associated with, the Air Force, and they, he just gets wrapped up in this, national pride, not realizing that like due to that it's everyone's doom, and it's he has to navigate those emotions like immediately, but at such a heightened level. He's amazing in this role. He's great.
And anytime an actor gets to be over the top and stretched to the logical absurdity, and they use it, I'm in. All right, so my number 2 is Fight Club. Always has been, always will be.
Nice.
I am actually very surprised a Fincher film is not on your list. Did a Fincher film drop off of your list because of the one or two that have in the last 5 or 6 years been put on, or did you never have Fincher on your top 10 list? I can't remember.
I had Fight Club on my list way low down, and it dropped off. Fight Club and Top Gun dropped off.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Top Gun, that's right. Well, see, that would have balanced the equation a little bit, where people can say, like, they're going to think I'm a cheeseball romantic person who's got nothing better to do than cry at fathers playing baseball and stuff like that, and special effects and all that other stuff. They're going to look at you like, boy, you have a dark disposition. And the polar opposite is true in real life. Like you're like this lighthearted, easygoing guy, and I sort of had this kind of, I wouldn't say melancholy, but there is a brutishness to me in real life that has served me well, but it's there. But our movie taste is polar opposite. So Fight Club and Top Gun. Top Gun should stay on there just to give it a little bit of balance. I'm just saying.
It's the movie I've seen the most. I've probably seen that movie 100 times or 150 times just from being a kid. But yeah.
Well, everybody's listening to the podcast right now just went, whew, okay, we're not as worried about Josh as we thought we should be after his list. Okay, Fight Club. 1999 again. Fincher, Pitt, Norton, Meatloaf,
Carter.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's so great. Oh, my. I have loved her from day one, and I keep seeing movies that she's in. Helena Bonham Carter is who we're talking about. And I keep going back to this character thinking it's just unlike anything that she's ever done. It still has that kind of in-your-face quality that she has in some of her movies. Actually, the closest character that she plays that's close to this one is Bellatrix Lestrange in the Harry Potter films. This is kind of the closest, and it probably just has to do with the dark clothes and stuff like that. But her character is Marla, and she is the reason why the movie exists to begin with, and without her, this movie could not go forward. And it's a great part, and it's written extremely well, and it's extremely well acted. There's just something about this movie that when I first saw it, I understood it completely. I'm really good at figuring out twists. I'm really good at going, that's Kaiser Sose. That's, he's this, she's that. They're in love. They're hiding. He's gay. She's not. I'm really good at figuring out the twist very early into films, to the point where people are like kind of disappointed for me because I can figure it out very easily. This is one where I did not figure it out. I did not see it coming. I registered all of the milestones, if you will, in the film where he said certain things that I went, well, that was odd. Why would he say that? And it registered, but I couldn't figure out how they were connecting. And I knew they were connecting to something, but what they were connecting to is not what I would have ever expected. I didn't have an understanding where they were connecting at all. And I literally came out of my chair when I saw it in the movie theater and I went, wait, did anybody else see that coming? Like literally that loud. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I was younger. So, I have better movie etiquette than I did back then. But I was so taken aback by the plot twist. And I can never pronounce the writer's name. Can you say his name for
Chuck
me?
Palahniuk.
Chuck Palahniuk. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Palahniuk.
It just looks way more complicated than Palahniuk. But okay. Well, I read the book too, and it's great. There's only a few differences, and I always love when it matches up fairly well. But there are these lines that are in this movie that I continuously quote to this day. How's that working for you? What? Being clever. They're just things that just consistently come up in my dialogue throughout my normal life that come from this movie. So this is where Fincher solidified himself for me. This is where I learned his name because of this movie. Now, is 7 before this? I can never remember. No,
Yes.
7 is after this, right?
Nope.
No, 7 is
7
after.
is 1995.
Okay, that's what I thought. I remember seeing 7 and thinking, this guy's got something to say, but I don't remember his name. For whatever reason, I did not connect Fincher to Fight Club and 7 until later on. And then I went, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. They have this kind of starkness and this darkness and this just moldy newspaper. Obviously, that's a direct reference to Fight Club, but there's just this stank on these films. And it's because Fincher takes it seriously. I know somebody who worked on 7, and one of the scenes, the scene where the guy, I think it was Sloth, who had all of the pine-scented Christmas trees hanging from his ceiling, I believe that's the warehouse where they had to gut out the whole bottom floor and they had to drain it out because it was flooded just for that one scene because that room looked perfect. And that's Fincher. Fincher takes the time to do, and back then that was probably more difficult to do because nowadays you can just add things to it with computers and you can still get the same feeling or the same look. You might not be able to get the same feeling, but he takes his time. He is meticulous, and you can feel it in movies. You can feel it in the way that he has a specific way he wants his actors to deliver the dialogue. There's a certain cadence he wants. There's a certain structure to how they speak, and they never waver from that. And it's extremely evident in Fight Club. Just listen to the pattern of the way Brad Pitt talks versus the way Helena Bonham Carter talks and the way Edward Norton talks. Of course, they're not doing anything different with their normal accents, but their rhythms are different. And there's something just so well structured about this film. Plus, I like the concept. I like the idea of something underground that most people don't know about that actually is helping people, even though it's sort of bad for you. I like that whole idea of being involved in something that you don't speak about unless you're actually there. I don't know what that makes me out to be, some kind of cult following person. I don't know. But I just like that whole idea that people are committed to something that might not be what society thinks is good for them, but yet ends up being healthy for them, healthier than the choices that have been given to them up to this point. Although, when you do see the twist and the turns, you do realize that this is just not mentally stable on any kind of level. So it's just well structured. I like every interaction between Brad Pitt and Edward Norton, especially after you find out the twist and then you go back and watch it again. You think to yourself, it's almost as if they're in the scene by themselves when they're together. It's that well constructed. And it's constantly coming up in conversations, not just the quoting lines, but it's constantly coming up in conversations where it's sort of like a barometer for how I can understand how somebody will react to a situation. Hey, have you seen Fight Club? Yes. Would you join a fight club? Yes. I'd beat the hell out of that guy. Well, now you know that maybe that person at work is not exactly the person you want to get that close to because they went there. It's become this barometer for me, and it's consistently the movie that first comes up in my mind's eye whenever anybody says top 10 list. It's the first one out of my mouth. It didn't make number one, and there's a reason for that. It has a lot to do with I don't really like ranking things anyway, and then once I rank them and they stay in a certain position and they stay there for a while, then they stay there. But there's just not enough to say about this film. It's not a film for everybody. It's not one of those films that I would necessarily recommend to people who are trying to watch movies that are like Citizen Kane or On the Waterfront. It's not that type of movie, but it is a movie that I think if you have a certain disposition and attitude in this world, an attitude not in a bad way, just the way that you see the world, it allows you to be cynical, but at the same time, you can stay yourself. And I don't really have an issue with cynicism. Sarcasm, definitely. Cynicism, not so much. So it's good to be able to understand people who see that in the world. And it talks about the material world we live in, and this is 1999. It's before online shopping. It's before being able to just order anything and it being delivered to you the next day. It's before Amazon Prime. It's before all of that stuff. And you actually see Edward Norton in the beginning of the film ordering from a magazine or
He's
QVC.
calling, yeah.
No, it's that's a magazine, right? He's the calling center, and it makes a subject out of what really makes us who we are as human beings. Is this couch make us who we are? If this new tie, is that makes us who we are? And then we actually, judge people based on what they can afford and what they can't afford. Is that really what makes us who we are? So this movie was not well received at first. It was divisive. People either loved it or hated it. I can't figure that out for the life of me because I just can't see how people can't appreciate it as a film, period, let alone, the subject matter. It's a fantasy film, basically. I mean, it's not real. These things don't exist. So I guess film's fantasy anyway. But people got really up in arms about this film and started to be, it's uber violent, it's this and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I think that's missing the point. The point is that you want to be healthy enough to not have to join a fight club in your life. So it's good to see that these images of these Calvin Klein models are not what we need to live up to, because then we don't need to take the frustration out by beating somebody up every Friday and Saturday night. It's just one of those movies. I think people need to see it and read the book. If they're interested in movies that make a statement, it reminds me of a lot of what Paul Thomas Anderson does, but we talk about Fincher and Anderson in the same spotlight all the time. But it has this feel of a filmmaker trying to say more than what is actually there. He's trying to bring something up and he's trying to question things. And when this big controversy happened, I was like, but isn't it good that we're talking about things like this? This is it. You're not meant to go beat people up. You're meant to talk about how to not go to beat people up. And plus, it's got Meatloaf with bitch tits, and I just wanted to say bitch tits really bad. I don't know if you have to edit that out or have to put a rating in it now, but that's in the movie, so technically it's a quote.
We'll let it slide. Okay. All right. Well, see, so Fincher made it onto one of our. I would have loved to have Fincher on my list. It's just, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I did a Fight Club on there, and it's just, it slid off because it seems like it's more of a, to me, it was more of a, of the time type of a movie, and I don't feel the draw to go back to it as much as I feel the draw to go back to Social Network or Zodiac. And I think, once again, it's, I think Zodiac's right about the spot where Fincher just really grabbed onto his art and just completely bent it to his will. And he had the ability to add in a lot more of the special effects and CGI, and using CGI for things that were, subtle. I mean, he used CGI for subtle things in Fight Club, but he was able to really kind of massage it in Zodiac, and I thought that was really, really cool. Okay, my number one.
Then why is Zodiac on your list?
It's an honorable mention. It's like top 15.
Did you mention that?
I did. I talked about Zodiac and Social Network earlier.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Okay. So my number one favorite movie of all time, and I will watch it whenever, wherever. It's Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I absolutely love this film. I've loved it, for most of my life. It came out in my birth year. So there's never been a time in my life that Raiders of the Lost Ark did not exist. So, and that gives me comfort. I think this movie is, you've got George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, wanting to work together. And, I think that it sounds like from the kind of the origin stories of this movie and this franchise, that they wanted to kind of give people the feeling that they had in the movie theaters watching some serials that they watched as kids, and having a strong protagonist and somebody who's confident in their capabilities. But the key to the Indiana Jones character for me is the fact that he's not infallible and he's not perfect, and he has to deal with problems all the time. And he never, even the very beginning of the movie, and the way that he's introduced to the audience is in this grandiose way. You don't even see his face until after he takes his whip and knocks the gun out of the would-be attacker's hand, and the guy runs away and all that. That's an amazing intro to a character and to the actor Harrison Ford, but in this movie. But then ultimately he barely makes it out, and then ends up losing losing the idol that he was going for. And so we kind of start off this movie with a failure, with he set out to do something and he barely made it out alive. So, and also in that scene, it sets up not only that, it sets up his fear of snakes, and it sets up Belloc for later on. We get all of these, his facility with the whip and all that. We get all that in that opening scene. In a lot of ways, it's similar to like a cold open for a James Bond movie. If you're wanting to set up structures, the title, there's not really like a title sequence. It's just titles over the opening sequence or the cold open, whatever you want to call it. But it's effective. And then we get to meet Marion, and I think that as far as characters go, her introduction is an amazing introduction. In a lot of ways, is just as great as Indiana Jones. Seeing her kind of like going back and forth, with the drinking contest with that huge, I guess he's like Russian or Mongolian or something, and she's able to literally drink him under the table. So it's a great intro. Some of the shots that they use, especially in that scene where they use silhouette, how he's you see him first in silhouette, how they use the silhouette, the fire to use some of those framing devices of his silhouette versus some of the bad guys that are coming in. The music in this, the score in this is absolutely amazing. It's John Williams, who is coming off of the Star Wars scores and all of that, and Jaws obviously, and he's able to create these themes that he's able to use throughout the film, and they just sing. They're just amazing, and we get to watch this this couple and Salah and fighting back and forth and bickering, and we get to see this, these characters move through all these different set pieces, and it's kind of before we have like a plug and play Fast and the Furious, like we need a set piece here, at the beginning of the movie we need one, to 20% of the way through, we need one halfway through. There's not like this kind of like scripted, specific formula for all of the different things, the boxes you have to check. But we, in this movie, you still go from action scene to action scene, or at least, well, that's not necessarily true. You go from something with stakes to another thing with stakes, whether it's, his interaction with when she gets kidnapped, when Marion gets kidnapped in Tunisia or wherever they're at. I guess Egypt. Is that Egypt? Yeah. And so they're, I guess they shot in Tunisia, but all of those things, we keep moving the story forward, and we get comedy. Famously, you get the sword versus gun scene, done very well for comedic effect. We get, there's, one of the great, greatest funny scenes is when they're on that vessel, and she's kind of trying to take care of him, and he's really all beat up, and she ends up like smashing his face with the mirror when she's like, what did I do? So all of those scenes are just awesome. And in the movie, like the last time I watched it, it seemed like it got to the end so much quicker than I'd remembered. So the pacing of this movie, it just keeps moving forward and forward and forward. There's not a lot of lulls, even when he's kind of like really sad after she gets kidnapped, and he's got the monkey with him and all that stuff. It still kind of pulls you forward. So I mean, this movie is, it's hard to describe your favorite movie of all time, or even to validate why it's my favorite movie of all time, other than the fact that I think that it has something for every moviegoer. And even though the movie was made, 37 years ago, it's still just as engaging as it was, I think, to the moviegoers back then. I think that it ages really well. A lot of that probably has to do with it being a period piece, and a lot of the effects being done are practical effects, so we don't have the fatigue of possibly bad CGI, things like that. So I think all of that plays to its strength, and you've got great performances by Harrison Ford and Karen Allen and John Rhys Davies. I mean, it's just awesome. So beat that.
I can't beat that. First of all. Second of all, it's not a competition. Third of all, I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark in the theater when it came out.
That's awesome.
So
wow,
beat that. That just makes me a lot older than you, but I did see it in the theater when it first came out. Yeah, it's epic at its best. And it is, here's the thing. It's got a lot of texture to it, and it's got a lot of depth to it, but in the end, it's just always fun to watch. It just is. You can put it on. You don't have to think about it if you don't want to. You can think about it because what's at stake is pretty high. And whenever you're dealing with the enemy that is the epitome of enemies, then the stakes are always really high. So it's just one of those movies that works from beginning, middle, and end. And I love the fact that you mentioned Karen Allen's introduction and how she drinks the guy under the table. It's sort of revolutionary for 1981 to have a woman who is not now she does become the cliche captured
damsel in distress,
damsel. Yeah. But up to that point, and that's for, of course, narrative purposes too. But up to that point, she's toe to toe with him. She's as strong and as smart and as resourceful as he ever will be. And, when she sees him, you're not sure if she's over him. When he sees her, he is not over her. Mm-hmm. But of course, you find out she's just kind of like hiding it, if you will. but that just means she's stronger than him, that she can hide what she's felt before and it doesn't affect her now. So, not to beat that, but the movie that always comes to mind and the one that is number one only because we had to rank them 1 through 10, but it comes to mind every single time. It is the movie I have seen 35 times in the movie theater. And you go, how is that possible? It's because when I was in high school, right out of high school, a friend of mine worked at a movie theater and she would let us sneak into movies. And that was the time The Breakfast Club came out. And I saw that movie 35 times in the movie theater. And that movie speaks to me now. It spoke to me then. The whole idea of different people from different class structures coming together and finding some kind of equal ground was important to me back then, or it's important to me now. And I used to talk about that because I hated high school. So this is an important movie to me because it proved to me there's a world outside of high school, a world I knew existed, a world I was not getting to until after high school, but I knew it existed. And it came at that perfect time, right as around the time I graduated from high school. And I used to say back in high school, if all these people got locked in the gym overnight, we would all end up being friends because we all got to go to the bathroom. We all got to eat. We all come from same backgrounds. It's just that there's stupid things like our clothes and our haircuts and our, clear skin or not so clear skin, or our pockets are full or they're not full, or our parents are doctors or they're shoe salesmen. There's just those things that are different. It's not as humans we are different, just the things that we can buy and the societal standards that we put on ourselves. To actually have a film where young people of that age talk about those subjects was important to me. And I actually think it's an important film for generations to come. A lot of people think the dialogue is dated, but it doesn't sound any more dated than when you see something back in the 40s and they call somebody honey or sugar pie or whatever the name they used for women back then. Yes, that's not necessarily a good thing because it is a bit misogynistic in tone, but that's the language and that's the dialogue of the time. But I don't have any problem adapting to that when I'm watching something like Bringing Up Baby, which is a great film, by the way. I don't have a problem adapting to the language of Shakespeare if you listen closely enough and the actors are in sync with that. So I don't necessarily have a problem with the dialogue. Some people do. I just don't. And it comes down to one thing and always one thing for me: performances. And all of those leads, they put in performances of their life. The 5 leads are amazing. Molly Ringwald, amazing. Ali Sheedy, amazing. Judd Nelson. Although, Emilio Estevez and Judd Nelson don't do a whole lot of work now. Actually, I was looking at Judd Nelson's bio, and he's been working nonstop. We just don't see him as much per se. He's not as in high profile stuff. He's got a new TV show coming out, and Emilio Estevez has a new movie that he directed coming out. And then Anthony Michael Hall rounds out the cast of the 5 main teenagers. And there's not a stinker in the bunch. There's not one that is not as well written as the next. They're all entrenched in their own characters. They're believable. I used to think Molly Ringwald didn't look like the character that she was playing at the time. The fashion sense didn't make sense to me, being in the 80s. But now when you look back on it, she actually is perfect. She just looks like the little rich girl. She does. And if they had put her in something from 1984, then it would have dated it. It's strange how those characters still exist nowadays in high school, and especially the costumes. If you look at the costumes, people are still wearing Letterman jackets, and they're still wearing high top Converse dark shoes with big scarves around their neck, and they're still wearing leather jackets, and they're still wearing, pocket protectors, and they're still wearing boots that are way too expensive to be worn to high school. They're still doing all of that. And it's either a good thing that John Hughes has pointed it out, or a sad thing that he's pointed it out, that we are in this society that we have these characters that continuously go on and on and on. The great thing that he did, God rest his soul, because when he died, it really hit me hard, because I thought, wow, he's my childhood. He is my coming of age time. And without him, I would not have believed there were bigger and better things in this world that I could look forward to. With him, it made me go, okay, I'm not as odd as I think I am. I do have people in my life that are important. These things are speaking to me. It's the first movie I remember emotionally connecting to. I've probably connected to a whole bunch of different movies in the past before that, but this one I emotionally connected to. It's got great quotable lines. It's got moments in it that are hilarious. There's a little bit of illogical things that happen that only in a movie that would happen only in a movie. But that's okay because they take it there and he throws it over the top and you're good. But that sequence where they're all sitting around talking and the camera goes behind the one wall pillar and then comes back around when Emilio Estevez is giving his speech, it's heart-wrenching. It's devastating what he's talking about, but it's the first time in a movie that I ever noticed that why does the camera not just go by that wall? Why does it jump from one space to the next? Because that would not be the natural movement of that camera. And he doesn't. He takes the time. He goes right in front of that pillar, and the time that that camera spins to go around that whole sequence is the same time it's in front of that pillar. For that split second, I think maybe it's 2 seconds, that pillar is in the shot. That's it. It's like this white wall, and then it goes to the next one as you're crossing in front of the kids. It's a great shot, and it's a great scene. And the climactic scene of that, are they going to be friends on Monday for Friends Now? That is. That scene right there is so extremely well acted by all of them that it's ridiculous that they're in their early 20s and their teens. Just they're natural born actors. That scene when Molly Ringwald goes back and forth to Judd Nelson is just great. And here's how, I don't have to justify anything being on my top 10 list because it's my top 10 list, but here's how it's justifiable that this film is on it. It has been infinitely imitated, infinitely respected. It's mentioned in thousands of movies since. There's a whole movie based on John Hughes films, 80s films, and these type of films that imitate it. And just recently, the cast of Wonder Woman 1984, the new Wonder Woman film came out all posed as the Breakfast Club. Did you see that? With Gal Gadot, Kristen Wiig, the director Patty Jenkins, Chris Pine.
Mm-hmm.
I always get those mixed up. Yeah. And then I can't remember who the other person is, but they're posed as the Breakfast Club. So the reason why films stick out to me is what I said in the beginning of the podcast. I still feel exactly the same way I did the first time I ever watched this movie. And every time it's on, I can't watch the edited version on TV. I can't do that. Just there's something about the jumps in that bug me. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. But since I know the dialogue so well, it's hard. But it's one of those films that I'm happy exists because I know everybody who's underneath me, all the generations coming up, they're going to experience this movie. And so maybe it's just a little bit of jump start on not being so stuck in high school frame of mind. Maybe it's helped people, and I'm sure it has because it helped me. It helped me understand there's a bigger world out there because when you tighten in on a small world, you realize there are bigger and better things out there. So the Breakfast Club. And I think the first time that we ever talked about this on one of the podcasts, I actually was able to quote the poster because I memorized it and it just stuck in my head for some reason. It just is always there. And I own the original poster too. So I don't remember memorizing it. I just remember always knowing it, the quote that's on the movie poster. So it's one of those movies that people might laugh at a little bit that it's somebody's number one favorite film, but it's just important to me. So that's why it's number one.
All right. Well, I'm looking at the Wonder Woman Breakfast Club picture, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, and I
love that they did that.
Patty Jenkins as Judd Nelson, so that's crazy.
Oh yeah. Who's the guy to the right?
I do not know.
Is he one of the writers?
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe he's a villain or something.
Well, I
don't
mean,
know.
Kristen Wiig's the villain. She's Cheetah, I think. So,
Yeah.
don't know.
But, sometimes there's always one or two people. Maybe he's a producer.
Yeah, never know. Okay. Well, we've been going for a while, so I'll wrap it up here. You can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. You can go to facebook.com/actorandengineer. You can tweet us at actorengineer, and you can go on iTunes and give us a review, which would be very helpful, and that will help us kind of move up in the charts, and we can get more listeners and guests and all kinds of crazy, awesome, funky things. And we'll have 200 more episodes, and then maybe in our 400th episode, we'll do our top 10 of all time again and see if it changes, or top 5 or something. We'll figure it out. Okay, we'll see you next week.